Hello, everybody, and welcome to our second facilities management webinar of the year. This one entitled Getting the Most from the NEC4 Facilities Management Short Contract. Just before we sort of begin, I'd just like to give a just sort of quick run through of how this is going to go. So yeah, as I said before, the subject for today being the NEC4 Facilities Management Short Contract, we'll be discussing, or rather Ross and Ian will be discussing what it is and how to get the most from it. And hopefully this will be very useful for you all. Just before I hand over to Ross and Ian, I would like to say that there should be a attendee sort of questions or Q&A box on the side of your screen. If not, I think there is a sort of white triangle on the right hand side that you could click and it sort of pops out the question box. So please feel free to ask as many questions as you can as you are watching, and we'll be answering those as we go along. So yeah, without further ado, I will hand over to Ross and Ian.
Okay.
Right, Ian.
Thank you, Farhan. If you can, yeah. Okay, so I'll introduce myself first and hand over to Ross. So my name is Ian Heaphy. I'm a member of the NEC4 contract board, and I've been involved in drafting the 4th edition of the NEC contracts and was directly involved in producing the facilities management contracts, of which the short contract is one, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
And I'm Ross Hayes, and I'm the other one of the team that were designing and building together that FM contract, and have been working on it for some time. I'm a consultant, work with the NEC as a drafter and trainer. So that's me, and that's Ian. And if you could move on the next slide, please, Farhan. I'm asking Farhan to manage the slides for us, so he's trying to guess when we're coming in and when we want to change slides. So forgive us if we get it wrong occasionally. But if we give it to one of us to manage, you lose our smiley faces, and that would be really sad, wouldn't it? So I'm just going to cover a little bit of what we're going to do today. Ian's going to pick up and talk about a good chunk of it, and then we'll move backwards and forwards. Can I re-emphasize the comment that Farhan said at the beginning? If you do have a comment or question during the course of it, please do put it up as we go along. I'm watching and monitoring those. Derek's saying we've got a lot of echo. I don't, is that me echoing? I'm trying hard not to do it. I can't control it much from my end. I'll see what we can do. We're going to look at the FM short contract today and where you might use it, what sort of work you might use it for, and what's the benefits of using it over its bigger brother, if you like, and also how you put the documentation together. We want to then pick up particularly 2 points of the FM contract suite: the ordering work process and the incentivization that you can build into the contract should you want to. And that's a big if. Do you need it or do you not? But at this particular point, I'm going to pass over to Ian, because Ian's going to pick up the sort of issues of what it is and when you use it and how you use it. Ian.
Okay, thank you, Ross. So in terms of what is the FMSC, that's the term we use to describe the facilities management short contract, referring to it by its initials, FMSC. So this is basically a contract to enable a client. That is the term we use to describe the organization that is requiring the service. So it enables a client to engage a service provider. And again, service provider is the term that we use within the contract to describe the organization providing the service. So it's a contract to enable a client to engage a service provider to provide any type of service anywhere in the world. So it's inherently flexible in terms of the nature of the service that can be procured, and it's designed to be used anywhere in the world under any governing law, any jurisdiction. The service is provided for a period of time, what we refer to as the service period, and the service will take place at the client's property, and the contract is designed to be used where there's an element of physical works taking place It is not a consultancy only contract. There will be delivery of a service at a client's property under the contract. So in terms of when you would use this short contract, because this is what we're talking about today, the short version of the FM contract, as the name would suggest, it's a short, a relatively simple contract that is designed for use where you don't need sophisticated management techniques, where the work is relatively straightforward, the work and service, and it only imposes relatively low risks on both the client and the service provider. It's also not designed to be used where there is extensive renewal or replacement of an asset required. There are other contracts more suitable in those circumstances. So in terms of, guidance on when you should use the short contract as opposed to the full contract, it's not really around value or duration. It's much more around risk and the management procedures required to manage the service being delivered. Don't find if you can just skip on a couple of additions to the slide. And again, yeah. So as I say, it's not about value or duration. And what we don't do as the NEC is give any sort of monetary values or guides on when you switch from the short contract to, as Ross described, its big brother, the full facilities management contract, because it may be that you have a relatively long duration contract. Maybe it's landscaping, grass cutting, where you're going to have a contract to cut all of the grass for a local authority over a 5-10 year period. That could be quite a lot of value, quite an extensive duration, but because the work is simple, you could use the short form contract. Whereas you could have a much shorter duration contract, a lower cost contract for perhaps providing security services. But if they're security services for a nuclear power station, you may then need those more sophisticated management techniques that would require the use of the full contract as opposed to the short contract. So it's all about risk and complexity. It's not about values and durations. We can move on.
Ian, asking a question, if I can butt in, do you think there is actually a limit on its value? I mean, you've just said there isn't, but I mean, presumably there is a point at which you would say this has become complex purely because of its value.
Yeah, it's a fair challenge, but I still feel that if the work is relatively straightforward and it is something as simple as grass cutting, okay, when the value gets to a certain level, there could be issues maybe in relation to payment. But in terms of the liabilities, the exposure to risk, that would still remain relatively constant. Though I suspect that possibly organizations and their advisors may feel that when you get to a certain level, that you may need more sophisticated techniques to maybe bring a contract to a conclusion if you needed to terminate early, if there was challenges around some of the payment mechanisms. But even then, I still think that the key driver is this risk and complexity factor.
Right.
So in terms of when would you use the FMSC, what type of services? As I've mentioned already, there's no limit to the service that can be procured under the FMSC. And there's some examples of the types of services it could be used for on the slide. I won't go through all of those, but I've already mentioned things like landscaping. I've already mentioned security services, other services such as cleaning, window cleaning. All of those sorts of softer FM services can be procured under the contract, but also you can use it for what you may term as harder FM. So in undertaking building repairs or lift maintenance, doing pothole repairs. So the idea is it can be used for any type of facilities management related service.
I've just had a question in from James asking whether we are making the slides available. The session is being recorded, if I'm right, Farhan, please confirm that with me. And therefore, in a sense, they're being made available that way through. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. So they'll be recorded and made available online shortly, I'd say this afternoon. Yeah, we've also got another question in from Richard Patterson. Will NEC be publishing a short comparison document between the FMC and FMSC? It would be helpful.
It's certainly not something I'm aware that NEC is producing currently. In relation to the NEC suite, we have a range of full contracts and short contracts, and we haven't sort of historically provided a comparator between the two. We do have some slides and some information that gives a bit of an overview and highlights some of the key differences that we could potentially formalize into a more structured document. So interesting to maybe see what other people think as to whether that would or would not be a useful document to produce.
It could be published as a guidance note to start with, couldn't it, to get it up issued quickly?
Yep, potentially so. Okay, just moving back to the slides, if we could just move on again, please. So in terms of the benefits of the FMSC, I think for me, one of the key benefits is it provides a standard yet flexible form of contract with a reasonable allocation of risk between the parties. It's a member of the NEC family, so if you're already using NEC contracts within your organization as either a client or a service provider, you will have familiarity with it. And what you don't need to do is create bespoke contract arrangements that are new to the market, that people are going to have to get reviewed by their legal teams. They're going to have to try and work out how it's going to be operated, how the payment mechanisms and other things will work. Here we have a standard you can use. It has some flexibility within it that we'll talk about later, but it allows you to have an out-of-the-box contract that the market should begin to understand and recognize. So you get consistency of approach. You hopefully get better bids, people understanding what they're actually entering into contract to do, and having that reasonable allocation of risk between the parties. It's designed to work as part of the NEC suite, so it can be used as part of a wider range of services or works being procured. And with it being this short, simple document, it's meant to be more straightforward, easier to understand, easier to use, hopefully making it less intimidating, more accessible to SMEs, the small and medium-sized enterprises who may be a little bit intimidated if they get these very large, complex contracts through. They may think they don't want to bid for that type of work. Hopefully with this document, its simplistic approach, though still covering all the key elements required, it's going to make it more engaging to a wider part of the supply chain.
I've got a question coming on when you might use it about a hotel owner wanting a service provider to run the premises for them. Could you use the FM contract in this case? It depends, I guess, how much work that service provider is doing. If they're going to subcontract everything else, have you got really a management agent agreement? But you could use it in that context. You just have to say that the FM provider is essentially doing is managing it on your behalf and is providing the service. As far as you're concerned, how they do it is up to them. Whether there's a level of risk that you want to move it up depends on how big your hotel is, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess it also depends on the nature of that service and how much control the service provider will have over it. We'll talk later about some of the key aspects of the short contract and also touch on the main contract. But one of the differences is the requirement for plans and mobilization plans and demobilization plans that you get under the full contract that aren't necessarily required under the short contract. So it comes back to that risk and complexity, numbers of interfaces. They need to sort of time or maybe coordinate the work of the service provider and others that may possibly then lead you more to the full contract rather than the short contract. And you'd have to work your way through that to look at the nature of the service.
Right. Let me pick it up from here and look at some of these key points that Ian's been talking about. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the major parts and the distinctions of the contract. It's a price-based contract. The whole purpose of it hasn't got the sort of flexibility of wanting cost-based or target-based contracts. It's meant to be relatively straightforward. So it's a price-based contract. Price-based contract. It can be on fixed prices. It can be on rates. So you can have a rate for doing something. You're doing hundreds and hundreds of potholes, or an hourly rate for your staff that are working for you, or you obviously can have just a fixed price to provide the cleaning in the building for a month to a specification. So it allows both, and it allows them to be combined. There is a little bit of choice in terms of adjusting your contract strategy. A few choices that the client has made. The first one is very much to do with inflation at the moment. Is obviously a key problem for many of the service providers and clients. And inflation can be brought in and can be added into it. There's a clause there that allows you to decide how you're going to do it and how you're going to put it into the contract. It allows for a limitation of liability. So there is an ability to limit the liabilities of the service provider in terms of total liability and in terms of the main liabilities they would carry. And because some of this work in the UK, at least, forgive us those coming in internationally on this, but in the UK, we've got the Construction Act, which applies to any work that sort of carries a label called construction. So if you've got that in your contract, if that applies to your contract, which it would do, for example, if you had a contract to do minor repairs in your buildings, then the contract has extra clauses that apply in that context and for that reason. So you pick and choose those as you need to when the client is putting together their contract data, which we'll discuss in just a moment. And there is an option to appoint a client's agent. We don't have a service manager. We don't have a particular distinct person who is managing this contract on behalf of the client. It's kept fairly simple. There's the client and there's the service provider, but the client can appoint an agent of their own if they need to, essentially to manage that on their behalf, and that can be done, and the contract allows that to be put forward. So those are some of the main points that are picking up there. And then going on a little bit, it has got the sort of processes that you would expect in a contract, but they're not necessarily as fully developed as you might expect them in a big complex contract. So we've got the ability to order work, and we've got something that is new to the whole of the FM suite, the concept of a service order. A service order is an instruction, as we'll see, to call off a piece of work. I would like you to go and fix this tap at a particular house. I've got a special party coming on tonight, so can you provide catering facilities or functions tonight? I've got somebody coming specially around our buildings, so we need security staff on after hours tonight. So there's a call off service order type approach. There is a process in the contract to pick that up. And we've still got always have the standard NEC approach of early warnings to try and manage the risk and proactively manage risk out of it if possible during the contract, to notify early warnings to each other of things that might happen that could be avoided if we get to grips with it. There's the compensation event process under change control, so we can edit and amend the service that we want them to do, make changes to it if we have to. Has to be an ability to vary a contract, especially if it's going to last for 5 years. So that's the compensation event process is in there. And it's a fairly similar compensation event process. It's the same as the other contracts and in the suite, for those of you who do know the NEC suite, but there is a process built in to manage the adjustment of the service. There's an I'll call it an option, really. There's an option to have a plan for the contract. NEC is always quite emphasizing programming and planning of the work, but in a minor contract, in a short form contract, you may not need a full-blown contract plan. If you want it, the client can ask for it and will specify what they want in it, but they may not need it. They may just want the service to be provided. Do you need much of a contract plan, for example, if all you want is 2 people at your front desk in your building during the day and 1 at night, 24/7 for 365 days of the year? You don't really need much of a plan behind that. You need to be sure the service will be provided. So the clients can determine what they need, the level of detail they need, or indeed whether they need it at all in the contract. And then we have the ability of having some sort of incentivization built into the contract. What is the performance you want? What is the impact of that performance? What you're going to do if you don't achieve it? And that is in something that the FM suite contracts now calls a performance table. And again, as we'll see later, it's optional in this short form because you may not require any particular incentivization. That's the service I want. That's the service I expect. If I don't get it, we'll deal with that problem when it comes. But I don't need to incentivize particularly either with a increased payment or reduction in payment, or in any other incentivization or deductions you can think of. Don't need to build that in. So the performance table in the short form is an optional extra or optional part of the contract.
And I think, Ross, just to add in there, this is where you do get this flexibility with the short form contract. The service ordering procedure, the planning of the service and the requirements for a contract plan, the performance table, these are options. The level of detail you can include within the scope. You can make this more extensive if necessary. You can keep it very simple. So you have, a relatively straightforward contract, but with the option to build into it additional requirements as necessary.
Yeah, and I think that's a point I'd make, particularly with the service contracts in general with the NEC, but this is personally true with this one. Because this contract can be used for any service, in one sense, by itself, it can't be used for anything. It's the framework for the service, but the effort has to come, as we'll see, in the scope. And you've got to determine in the scope what it is you want and the level of information you want to give to the service provider and you want back from them. If I'm going to use this contract for concierge services, cleaning services, and maintaining all the gas heating systems in a series of houses, then I've obviously got to determine and detail all that work very carefully in the scope, because there's no particular procedure that relates to concierge services or cleaning services or gas maintenance in the contract conditions themselves. So I have to just remember that because you can use it for everything, whatever you want doing has got to be very carefully detailed in the contract. So moving on, we're looking at the next slide, which talks about ordering work. The whole purpose of this contract is to provide a service, and you may be able to define the service at the beginning of beginning of your specification. You've gone out to tender to say, this is the cleaning service I want, and this is the specification I require. This is what I consider to be clean. Maintain it. You might, for example, also be saying, I want you to maintain or look after some of my building stock. I'd like you just to deal with the gas maintenance, and you have to do a service every year on gas systems. Just do it. Give me a comprehensive price for it, as a price per property, and go and do it. But equally, you might want to be able to change that scope as you go along. And you might want to be able to instruct bits and pieces as you go along through the contract. So the contract allows for all these. It starts with an initial service. That's what I want. That's what you've priced. It's probably a lump sum price for the service per month or whatever. And there's no obligation or requirement on the client to order that work. Once the contract's signed, off you go and do it. And the contract just picks that up and runs with it. The client has the ability to change the scope, so they might decide that their cleaning specification was too detailed or not detailed enough. They wanted it more cleaner or not as clean, or they wanted little bits and pieces doing to it. So they can change the scope like all NEC contracts, the client has the ability to change the scope. The remedy for that change, of course, is the compensation event, where the service provider comes back and says, fine, you've changed what you want, and this is the time, or more likely the financial implication of that change. We've now got this call off reactive approach, and we're calling those service orders. So there is a process built into the contract to call off a piece of work. I need those extra people at night. I need this extra piece of fencing looked after. I'd like you to go and fix that particular tap that I've just had a call in for. I've got a spillage on that particular property. Can you go and deal with it? All those would be reactive type instructions. We know it's going to happen. We just don't know when, and we don't quite know how often. And those are instructed by the client through what the contract calls a service order. And they can be instructed at any time during the service period. And what the slide doesn't pick up is that they must be finished within the service period. So they've got to be it's essentially a piece of work that's started and finished within it. And we're looking here particularly at things that aren't going to take very long and have to be done within a few days normally. But the process of how that's done is stated in the scope. But the service order is the mechanism for doing it.
And I think as well with that, Ross, that service order process allows the client to control that call off element. That work is only going to take place if the call off is issued. So placing the client in control of that element of the service, as opposed to the core element of the service you were referring to earlier, that will happen as determined by the service provider, subject to the constraints within the scope.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, the scope may have a constraint that says you can't do cleaning after 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, but quite how that's managed and when it's managed otherwise, so that would then sit with the cleaning service provider in that context, because that's the global service they're providing. So
whereas a deep clean may then be something that needs to be formally instructed by the client, that would then be the subject of the service order if, as and when it was required.
Yes, I've just picked up James's comment about the difference between the FM contract and the term service contract. I think we might leave that till at the end. Is that all right, Ian? Do you think? And we pick that distinction up?
I think it's a very good question. We will come back to it. But yes, I think we'll take that in the context of the whole presentation at the end.
So we've got, fine, could you move the slide on one, please, for me? Looking again at this service order, the contract defines the service order as being it's for work and in the form stated in the scope. So that immediately is pointing you to the fact that the client has got to determine what should this service order look like, and what's it going to include. The contract goes on to say it includes a detailed description of the work to be done, which is fairly obvious. In fact, I mean, there are sometimes you write a clause in a contract where you think, why do I need to write that? It's self-evident, but in this case, that clearly must be there. The time period for the work, unless stated in the contract. Now, that might be, you might have response times for this sort of work. You either put it in the service order, or it might be a stated standard response time for that type of work, in which case that would have been stated in the scope. And then there's this sort of get out of jail type clause bullet point at the end, and anything else which the scope states has to be required in the service order. And that gives the flexibility to the client to set up a process which relates to their type of work and what they're trying to do. The prices for that service order are assessed using rates and prices in the price list. And that's the point I wanted to make, that we're doing here work that we expect to have to do. It's just we're not quite sure when, or indeed how much of it's to be. So in many cases, that pricing may be just on people rates, rates of staff and material cost. In some cases, it might be a fixed price for doing that particular work. £30 or £20 to go out and clean up a spillage or whatever. So it can be any way that suits the parties that they want to use it for. Can you move me on one, please, Farhan? The incentivization for the contract is done through this performance table, if you want it. So you may not want to worry about incentivizing the contractor, service provider, sorry, you may just say, this is so straightforward, you just provide the work. I don't need to have any sort of incentivization or performance approach to it. But if you do want to, you can have that as a separate document. It's separate from the scope. For sort of technical thinking behind that, it's separate from the scope, so that the client can't just go and change it, because it's part of the pricing risk for the service provider. They are obviously pricing in the risk of achieving or not achieving those targets. And you can positively or negatively incentivize, if you can negatively incentivize anything. Essentially, you can have some sort of deductions or restrictions if they fail to achieve certain targets, and you can positively incentivize them if they overachieve. As an industry, the FM world is not good at as positively incentivizing. And I've had one or two clients who begin to step and think, is there any way we can do this? But the performance table would allow this to be done whichever way you want to do it. And you can clearly put limits on it. So you can say that, these are the deductions we make until you get to this particular level. So you don't have deductions going on and getting so big that the whole contract falls apart. Essentially, that performance table is something that is written by the client to suit the way they want to work. And there is no structure specifically given for that in the way that the contract has to have it written. It's written by the client to meet whatever performance approaches they want and whatever they think is an appropriate way of managing their contract. And clients have been doing it for years. It's not as if this is brand new. I think that's one of the things we have to keep remembering. This isn't something that's never happened before. Clients have been running these sort of contracts to look after their buildings for a very long time. It's pulling it all together in a proper structured way that makes it easy to follow. So have we got such a thing as a standard performance table? Ian, you can explain this one a little bit more possibly for me.
Yeah, I mean, this is just an example of a performance table that has been produced by the NEC. It was actually part of the X29 guidance, the new climate change option, which also features a performance table approach. And so this just gave a bit of an outline of what the performance table could look like. It's only an example. You don't necessarily have to follow it. Maybe a little bit possibly overcomplicated for the short contract that we're referring to. And really, it's down to the client to decide what it is they want to incentivize, what is important to them, and then how they're going to reward or possibly how they're going to have a negative impact if the service provider fails to achieve the performance level required. But this hopefully covers all of the information that could be necessary, but you could see a simpler version of this depending upon how the client was looking to incentivize, whether there's limitations on the incentivization, and how often or frequently that will be assessed and reviewed.
Yeah, I think we've all seen our own KPI tables of some description, which either follow some of these things or don't follow them, as the case may be. I mean, interestingly, looking at that list, I suspect each of you who are watching can think of something that you might want to add to that, or something you might want to take off it. And again, that's the whole purpose. You can have it your way. For example, it doesn't say who measures that performance. Is it the service provider or is it the client? And we all know that that's done in different ways under different contracts. So how is this contract put together? Ian, I'm going to pass this over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ross. So in terms of the structure, the contract itself, if you sort of get your hands on a hard copy or a electronic copy, tries to be hopefully a helpful document to enable users to put the contract together. We have a title page, and then we go into the contract data, which for those familiar with NEC contracts, this is where we capture the contract specific requirements. So we have the client's contract data, where the client will identify who they are, what's the service period, describe the service to be provided, etc. And then we have the service provider's contract data, where we describe who the service provider is, and then various information is provided in relation to things like people rates or fee percentages. We then bring them together and we have a service provider's offer. In other words, their sort of commercial offer to do the service. And then we have forms to allow for the client's acceptance. And these are sort of pro forma documents giving you the necessary pieces of paper, electronic or hard copy, to be completed to create the contract and put that in place, avoiding the need for other documents to be provided or produced by others. We then have the price list, which we've spoken about, and then we have the scope. And we've touched on that a few times already. The scope is probably the most important part of any contract, including the facilities management short contract, because this is the document that specifies and describes the service, what it is the service provider has to do, and then any constraints on how they do it. And things like the ordering procedures, requirements for any plans of how the service provider will provide the service, etc., will all be dealt with within that document as part of the scope. And then we have the optional performance table, which again we've spoken about a moment ago. So we just go to the next slide. You can see there's some examples, maybe difficult to see on the screen you're looking at, but the idea, these are the pro formas within the contract. So for the contract data, you have the relevant entries and then a blank box for the entry to be included. And you can complete these online electronically. If you want to go old school, you can print them off and fill them in hard copy, but that doesn't tend to happen so often nowadays. And then you have further pro formas and guidance documents for things like the price list, giving instructions on how it should be completed, giving a template. We then have the same for the scope, documents there that can be filled in, giving you pointers, guidance over what needs to be covered, what needs to be included, hopefully making this very accessible and easy to complete, particularly for those who may be new to it. I mean, they're just examples, so you don't have to follow those. They just give a guide over what we recommend should be at least considered when you're putting the documents together. And if we just go on to the next slide, we also have an example there of the performance table. It's optional, but again, providing guidance on how that should be put together.
I mean, Ian, in a sense, on that performance table, we've now got two examples that we've just shown you. One that was a bit more detailed, and one that's just got the sort of pro forma box to fill stuff in. So it is important that people realise these are templates, and you do it the way you want. Your price list might be effectively just a short schedule of rates that you've already got that you just want to attach and point to. So you would, in a sense, just reference it and not try and squeeze the quart into a pint pot of the price list on the sheet there. You just reference the one you want to use.
Yeah, absolutely. It comes back to, it's a standard contract but has this flexibility. These are guides, these are pro formas and templates that you can use, though obviously, clients and their service providers can look at alternatives and different ways of addressing it. Particularly if they've got existing processes, existing documents, they could use those, though they do need to be careful about language, about making sure they are compliant with this particular form of contract. So just moving on then, the NEC produces a series of user guides, and these are available for all of the contracts within the NEC suite. So we have a volume 1 user guide, how to establish a procurement and contract strategy, explaining which contracts to use and when and why, which options to select. And that volume 1 covers all of the contracts within the NEC suite. We then have a volume 3 on how to select a supplier. And again, that applies to all of the contracts within the NEC suite. And then we have a volume 2 and a volume 4 of user guidance, which is specific to each of the main contracts and each of the subcontracts. So there is a volume 2 specifically drafted for the facilities management short contract, detailing how you put that contract together, giving examples of a contract data entries, giving more detail over what should be included in the scope. We then have a volume 4, a management guide specific to the FMSC, going through all of the key clauses, describing how they're intended to operate and giving examples of them in use. So examples of communications required under the contract. So hopefully helpful documents to new users, particularly to understand how these contracts should be put together, how they should be effectively managed. In addition, the NEC produces flow charts for each of the contracts, main and subcontracts, and they're available electronically. And there's also a series of practice notes that are being produced in relation to various contracts, and in particular the facilities management contracts, and we'll touch on those again at the end of the presentation. So just moving on then, in terms of tips for successfully using the FMSC, key thing has got to be scope. I've already mentioned it's the most important part of the contract, getting that scope right, making sure it's clear what it is the service provider has to do, making clear any constraints on how they provide that service is going to lead to a more successful delivery. If we know what has to happen, any constraints on when it happens, how it happens, there's less chance for problems and disagreements later over how the service should be provided. As Ross has already mentioned, you can change the scope, though that would normally lead to a compensation event. And so trying to get it right at the start is always the best thing to do. Price list. Again, there's lots of flexibility over the price list and the performance table, you know, how they're put together, what's included, but you need to make sure there's clarity, that the parties understand in respect of the price list, what's covered by that item. You know, there needs to be a set of rules given as to the coverage for any items that may be subject to sort of remeasure, that we know what's within the item, what's excluded, etc. With the performance table, you need to make sure, if we do have one in the contract, that it's clear, again, what are the targets to be achieved, that they're objective rather than subjective. So we're not going to have disagreements over whether or not the performance levels stated have or have not been achieved. And we may need to consider additional conditions of contract. Hopefully you can see already the flexibility inherent within the short form contract, but there may still be a need to introduce additional conditions of contract. These may be driven by requirements of local law, things like public procurement requirements. If you're working in the UK, things like TUPE, there may be other legal issues you need to cover in the contract. You can do that by adding in additional conditions of contract, though of course you need to be mindful when introducing them that they don't cause any conflict or clashes with the existing terms and conditions. Ross, have you got anything to add around the additional conditions of contract particularly?
Not an awful lot. I mean, ironically, they're often, particularly with local government, central government type organisations, when they require certain standards in safety, security, confidentiality, freedom of information, you end up with a raft of clauses that sometimes seem as long as the main contract clauses themselves. But that is just the inevitability of working with those sorts of clients. You can't get away from it. And it's just making sure that they're written in the right sort of way, they're written in the right sort of language, preferably without any future tense clauses in it, that somebody has actually stepped back and thought, how do we make these work within an NEC approach rather than just lifting something they've used for the last 10 or 15 years and not thought about them. But you will have to have them sometimes in those contracts. And if you're going to start changing anything more significant, you need to think about how you're reallocating risk. And so will, of course, the service provider, because the client will pay for it somewhere. It's just how you're allocating that risk.
Okay, thanks, Ross. So just moving on again. So we've talked today about the short form of the facilities management contract. There is also the full facilities management contract, the FMC. So if you do think that your service needs that more sophisticated management techniques, you want a greater choice of pricing mechanisms, things like target cost, cost reimbursable, you want more options, ways of reallocating risk between the parties, you need to maybe look at more sophisticated management requirements, things like mobilization plans, demobilization plans, etc., then it may be better to select the FMC, the full contract. That also introduces a service manager to administer the contract on behalf of the client, and also includes processes to deal with upgrading, renewing, or replacing parts of an asset through secondary option X27 project orders, which also allows for project order programs to be introduced. So, if you do feel that the service you're procuring needs that level of management, that level of sophistication, then the FMC is the contract you can move to if that is what is required. Okay, I think that's it in terms of what we wanted to talk about today. So we'll open the floor to questions, and perhaps Ross will take that first question on differences between the TSC and the FMC.
Yeah, it's quite a difficult one, that, because we have two contracts that appear to be doing effectively the same thing. And I guess in many ways that is true. The FM short contract and the term service short contract are clearly from the same stable. And there is no reason in my mind why you couldn't use the FM short contract to engage for the building works that you're talking about, James. It depends what sort of building works you're talking about. If you're just talking about maintenance and clearance, then obviously it's the either contract would do it. The FM contract would do them through service orders if it was a call off work for building works, and the term service short contract would do it through what it calls task orders. The FM contract tends to be better structured and thinking through in terms of some of the areas of work that it's dealing with in terms of those service orders and the performance table. There's no performance table approach in the term service short contract. I think it's, in one sense, it's your choice of partly of language. The FM contracts suite was worked up, I will put a plug in for this, was worked up with the Institute of Workplace and Facilities Management, the IWFM, who'd come to us to say, look, we need a standard form of contract if we can do it, because we think it's necessary because we've got so many bespoke contracts. But the term service contract puts people off because it seems to be construction orientated in both its language and some of its processes. For example, the FM contract deals with a service failure, where the term contract would call it a defect, but it allows for the recognition that some service failures can't be put right. If you ask somebody to provide cleaning by 6:30 in the morning and they don't come and clean it, they've failed on two counts. They failed on the count that they haven't cleaned it, which obviously they can put right by coming. They failed on the count they haven't done it by 6:30 in the morning, which they can't put right because it's now 7 o'clock. And that sort of thinking is brought into the FM contracts in the way it deals with those sort of service failures through a performance table. It's not so easily dealt with in the term contract, but can be. It's just a matter of writing the term contract, the short contract properly, or bringing that in through the scope or through some other incentivization process. Is that fair, Ian?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, they're not materially different. As you've said, they come from the same stable. They're both contracts to provide a service over a period of time. The TSC, in terms of language, some of the processes may lend itself more to a a building environment to the harder side of FM, where the FMSC is meant to be sort of slightly broader in its approach, covering not just that harder FM, but those processes you've described in relation to the softer side of FM, the cleaning services, etc. So really it is down to users to decide which one they think is more suitable for their particular service, maybe for their industry and their supply chain. And so at the moment, you just have that range of options available with the different contracts that are produced. Okay, so we've opened the floor to any of the questions. If you'd like to put questions into the chat function, then please feel free to do so. Ross, if I may, just in terms of giving the broader picture about the contracts, we've talked about the facilities management short contract, but there's also a subcontract available as well.
There is. There's a subcontract to this form which we don't, and that is one point. There isn't a back-to-back short subcontract for the term service short contract. Yes, there's a back-to-back subcontract. Whether you would use it as a whether a service provider who was using the short contract would use the short subcontract is possible, but on the basis you've used it for a fairly simple contract, you probably wouldn't have those sort of subcontractors below it. But a main service provider, i.e. the service provider under the FM contract, may well want to use this subcontract as a subcontract for fairly simple work that they're doing. Let's say, for example, it is a building contract and they just want somebody to maintain or provide their catering services for their operatives working on site. That could be done through an FM short contract. So that is available. Like all the subcontract forms, it's back to back with time periods slightly adjusted to enable the early warning processes, for example, to run through the system in time, or for the compensation event notification processes, more particularly, to match each other in those two contracts. So yes, that exists, and it's there to be used.
Yeah, I think it comes back to that sort of the whole ecosystem of NEC contracts where, we have, for example, a design, build and operate contract, and it may be as part of the contractor providing the service under that contract that they need to engage service providers to support them as subcontractors. And you could use the facilities management subcontract, the facilities management short subcontract to do that, depending upon things like risk and complexity. So it is worth people being aware that we have this suite of contracts that can be fitted together to hopefully cover all the scenarios required. So, Ross, if I may, another question, and maybe it's touched on some of the following slides. The practice notes. I believe you've been involved in producing practice notes in relation to these contracts.
Yes, a few practice notes. We've got 2 or 3 for the FM suite coming out or have been out. The essence of a practice note, as opposed to the guidance books that we've got out, the user guides, are available. They've got lots of wealth of detail in it, but clearly they're quite difficult to keep up to date rapidly. If something changes that we want to change quickly, it's much easier if we've got something that's just on the website. So we are writing a series of practice notes, slightly different possibly from the practice notes that the NEC have written in the past. What we're trying to do here is to write notes to help people who maybe have not seen the NEC before, who are coming in it from the facilities management sector more than the construction sector. So we've written one, for example, on how to use social benefit clauses, picked up some of the social benefit requirements that the government is trying to push forward. And essentially the practice note talks a little bit about what's available, what's going on. And then there's a section that then says, now, if you wanted to bring this into your contract, where would you put it and how would you use it? There's one on the use of the FM contracts internationally. As Ian's just said, all the NEC contracts are international, but the FM world is often working across lots of different boundaries. To be fair, probably in the big contracts. and therefore how can the contract work, and what would you need to do, and how would you fill it in to make it work across international boundaries? So there's 2 or 3 of those coming in. There's I'm struggling to remember the next one that's coming out. I'm also looking at one. I'm certainly looking at one on the climate change side and incorporating that. It is already available. So, but you know, how would it then be put together? So those are the sort of things that are coming out. Fairly straight, 1 or 2 page guidance notes. They're not, and they're published on the website.
Yeah, and they're freely available as a download from the website, and we'll just show you in a moment how to access the relevant FM specific information from that website. A couple more questions come in from Richard. So do we have evidence of people using the FMSC as yet? I'm off the top of my head, I don't know whether the NEC does as an organisation, or Ross, whether you have any examples.
I haven't seen it being used yet. Oh, no, that's not. But I've seen examples where the term service short contract was used, where before the FM short contract was available, where I think I would now use the FM one instead, particularly for maintenance of small building maintenance. In fact, interestingly, where we were suggesting that it would be used. I would have seen it used in catering contracts, except for the fact that the client wanted to have a reimbursable approach to it, because we've got catering, you know, as we know, catering is fine if you've got a standard, a straightforward demand, but if your demand can fluctuate furiously, you might want to just do it on a remeasurement type of approach, reimbursable approach. So they've used the big contract, but it could have done in other circumstances. It could have easily moved across into a short form. So these contracts have only been out for a year, and often most organisations take 6 months to put through their procurement process. So we're only just beginning to see contracts being used.
Yeah, and I think it's a fair point as well that, you know, a lot of the existing arrangements may be for 3, 5 years, 10 years. And so it's only when you come to the end of that cycle would you then look to replace that with a new form. And we are seeing the main contract, the FMC, now being adopted. A number of clients are actively using that now. And so we would expect the short form hopefully to pick up with use as well. Okay, and then I think Richard asked another question. Is it easy to use the FM short subcontract under the FM? I think that is. So that's the FMC. Assuming you mean the full contract. And yeah, the idea is that it is written to be suitable as a subcontract form for both the main FMC as well as the FMSC, the facilities management short contract. In the same way that in the construction world, the ECSS, the engineering and construction subcontract, is designed to be used under both the ECC, the engineering and construction contract, as well as the engineering and construction short contract. So it's written with that same concept in mind. Obviously, we welcome user feedback as and when people start to use it in that capacity as to how suitable it is.
There's a question on whether the FM short contract is administratively simpler to manage than the big contract. I think the short answer to that is probably yes. The long answer is it depends a little bit on the administrative risk and complexity of the contracts you're looking at. The full contract is administratively heavy if, for example, there's an awful lot of change going on, and therefore there are dozens of compensation events going through the system. The short contract would equally could be administratively heavy on that same basis. But for example, if you want it to be simpler and you don't want a plan, or your plan is really a very simple one and you don't need it updating unless you bother to ask for it because you've got it and your contract's only going to last for 3 years, and you don't really need any performance information, so you're not really measuring KPIs except the obvious ones that you pick up between you and the contract service provider, then you're not going to have anywhere near such an administrative burden on it. So to a certain extent, that the short contract is written to be slightly simpler. If, for example, it's the contractor that notifies all the the contractor that provides the initial applications and invoicing. So there's a little bit more work placed on the service provider there, but it is in fact the way that they work anyway normally. So it's fairly straightforward. So
yeah, I mean, sorry, Ross, I'd echo that. I think without doubt the short contract is simpler in terms of its core procedures. You know, we simplify the compensation event process. There's less stages within that mechanism. Other actions with it in terms of termination, in terms of payment, it's a simpler process. So there should be less administration in terms of the inherent processes within it. You know, yes, we have change control, we have early warnings, but we don't have the requirement for early warning meetings or even an early warning register. So the administration should be simpler, but as Ross has highlighted, that will depend a little bit upon, you know, how much is added into the scope in terms of the requirement for a contractor's plan, the requirement for that to be updated. So, you know, at its core, it is a simpler contract than the main contract in terms of its administration requirements.
And I think, I mean, the sheer fact that the main contract is 75 odd pages long and the short contract is, what is it, 10 pages long, 8 pages long, or something like that, does inherently mean that it feels more appropriate to put that in front of a SME type organization, for example, or a small contractor around the corner, than to dump a 80-page contract on their desk and say, this is the one we would like you to follow. So it has to have that sort of appreciation of less work in running it, but you wouldn't use it for a complex contract which needs the big one.
Because I think we're possibly running out of time now. Hopefully we've answered all of the questions that have been raised. If not, we can always provide answers to those offline as part of the information we put online along with the recording of the session. But I think there's a couple of slides here just to talk through. I don't know, Ross or Farhan, do you want to take us through these?
I can pick up these a little bit. There is a new community app. The NEC has created an app for accessing all the NEC discussions, and material is on it. This slide picks up a little bit about how you can download it. So too does the website, the NEC website. But there is a FM section to it, which is only really it's fledgling at the moment. So anybody who's involved in the FM world and wants to come onto the app, it would be great if you joined the community, and then it's available to pick things up. There are various articles on the system, the various things available, and that's picking up in the NEC process, where you might pick up the FM special area to find out what's in that area, any particular practice notes that relate to it, anything that people are publishing, or any comments that's involved there. And then the last thing, I'm not sure if it's on the slide here, but there has been, yes, here we go. There's been a special issue of the FM newsletter. It's dated December 2022. I have seen it, so it must be knocking around somewhere, but it's now available, and it's just got articles that specifically deal with the FM contracts and the FM industry, and why it was written, and various things about how it can be used and things to watch out for. There's a set of articles in that newsletter. Farhan, it is available, isn't it? Is it available on the website?
So you should be able to access it via the My NEC section, so when you log in. But besides that, we will be sort of drip feeding these articles onto the news section of the website over the coming weeks. But if you did want the full newsletter in PDF format as it's shown in this image, if you go to the My NEC section when you log in on the website, it'll be under the resources tab.
I mean, that picture, in fact, is the Scottish Fire Service. They are using the FM contract. They're probably one of the very first users to switch across to the FM contract. They've been running it for some time now. So that's a big contract. So it is. We have got live users using the contracts now.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think, again, there's some upcoming training on the FM suite. Ross and I both deliver training in respect of this. I think Ross more than I. But we have a new training course, an introduction to the FM short contract. That's going to be available shortly. Ross, is that both sort of online and in person, or do you know?
As far as I'm aware, it could be done either way. It's a standard introduction to the contract, but it's looking at the short contract. It is written. It is done. It's in the sense of being available shortly. It's a matter of when clients want to pick it up and run with it. It is available. And because the short contract is shorter, you think, well, how can I make a day of it? So what it does is it's really aimed at getting people to have sessions where they think about, well, what would I need a performance table, and if so, what would I put into it? So there'll be a little bit more of that sort of development discussion during the day, I would hope, when we do it. Similarly, going on a bullet point, for there are now for the FM contract itself, we've now got 2 other days of training available, essentially splitting the procurement side from the managing side, similarly like the user guide books 2 and 4. So there's a day on managing the contract, which is a series of questions, and it's seminar work almost entirely, where delegates will sit together and say, okay, so this has happened, what would I do? What does the contract say? Or indeed, what does my contract say if it was an in-house course? And then there's the getting it right, preparing it, which has just been finished. So that is now will be available next year if anybody wants it, which is saying, how would I put one of these contracts together? What have I got to look out for? How might I, what guidance is for putting a scope together? That sort of thing.
So as always, go to the NEC website, neccontract.com, to get details on the training, to look at the white papers, and shortly you'll be able to also access a copy of this particular webinar as well. So I think just mindful of time, we need to wrap things up at this stage. So Farhan, Ross, thank you for your help and support on the webinar today. Hopefully those attending found it useful. If there are any outstanding questions, we will pick those up and respond after the event. Farhan, Ross, anything to add before we close out?
Not from me. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, nothing from me as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining. But yeah, just as everyone said, the recording will be available on the website later today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, thanks, everybody. Thank you and goodbye.